this is the part that makes me laugh, because we have a message for the two brothers and the longest ballot. After years of disruption to federal elections and months of parliamentary investigation, Parliament is finally stepping in. A new bill to amend the Canada Elections Act directly targets the tactics used to flood ballots with coordinated candidates, along with broader measures to strengthen election integrity. If passed, it could make the longest ballot committee strategy nearly impossible to pull off ever again. Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Bill C-25, an act to amend the Canada Elections Act and to enact an act to change the names of certain electoral districts. This was tabled on March 26th and has completed first reading. So, not expected that this would actually be tabled this quickly after the report was tabled earlier this week from PROC, but looks like they want to get on this as soon as possible. Here's the bill summary. So it's to establish new prohibitions and modify existing prohibitions, including in relation to foreign influence in the electoral process, accepting or offering a bribe, unauthorized use of a computer, making or publishing false or misleading information respecting elections and the candidate nomination process. Establish new prohibitions in relation to voting in a nomination contest or leadership contest. Prohibit the acceptance or use of certain contributions by political entities and third parties, including from anonymous sources. Providing for new requirements relating to political parties' policies for the protection of personal information, and expand the scope of certain provisions relating to the administration and enforcement of the Act, etc., etc., etc. So, if you recall, in the report from the Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs, or affectionately known as PROC, there was 7 recommendations that were actually in there. And virtually all of them are in this bill. So, that is kind of gives us all some goosebumps, eh? Because NP Nation gets a huge win here if this bill goes through. So it's it was interesting when reading this bill, because this bill is very, very long, and it included a lot more in there than just the recommendations that came out of, just PROC. But it also addresses foreign interference in a good way. It addresses stuff that was posted during the election campaign, deep fakes. We also saw those fake videos that were out there of both Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre and Jagmeet Singh, and they were all deep faked, making them say things that they weren't. And it's also to control, fake information that is going on during an election about candidates, so it makes it fair. In addition to adding penalties when it comes to violating the Elections Act. So, let's take a look. So here's one of the first things that it does that is significant to the longest ballot. The Act is amended by adding the following after Section 92. Conveying false or misleading information. Nomination paper. No person or entity shall convey or cause to be conveyed false or misleading information to be included in a nomination paper. No person who files a nomination paper under Section 67 shall include false or misleading information, and no person shall sign for a given election as an elector referred to in paragraph 66 the nomination paper of more than one prospective candidate. So this addresses virtually all the recommendations regarding the candidate and the nomination paper that I made and other people made when they testified at PROC. The single unique signature per candidate, that I think was a given. So a lot of us that showed up to testify, we all pretty much agreed unanimously on that. The Bloc didn't agree to that as a party, but it is what it is. They can vote against it if they want. So This is one of the biggest problems to the longest ballot is you're going to have to get individual people. Now, if you recall testimony, the chief electoral officer said, well, we don't know if we actually have time or the resources to validate every single signature. Fair, but they don't have to, right? I don't think they're going to worry about this unless there's a longest ballot campaign that starts happening. And even then, they may not be able to validate it during the actual election itself, but they will audit it afterwards. And this will only need to happen once, I think, to actually dissuade people from doing this ever again. And why would this dissuade people? Well, we're going to get to that. But the other aspects of this is if you are, having people sign something without a candidate name at the top, or if you're signing something where the person isn't actually registered as a candidate and you're telling people, you're presenting it as if they are, and then it comes to be known after the election is done that you were actually having people sign nomination form names of people that weren't even registered as candidates until after all that happened, then this is kind of where that fits in that you're trying to mislead the electoral officer when you're actually handing in your nomination form. So this really hits at the crux of one of the concerns that I was bringing to committee. Official agent ineligibility. The following persons are ineligible to be official agent for a candidate, specifically the official agent of any other candidate in the same electoral district. This, I think, was also a given. We said that we don't think it's going to stop the longest ballot, so they're trying to do this in Turbon to have everybody have an individual agent. They still had to have Kieran as the official agent for a couple of people, but it significantly reduced the amount of people that were interested in being on that ballot. That's for sure, because they had about 200 in Battle River Crowfoot, and they had a quarter of that interested and able to actually get on the ballot in the Turbon running. So even that change, that one change that they imposed upon themselves because they knew that this was most likely coming, that drastically reduced the amount of people that they could actually put on that ballot. So this is the thing. When you start adding these levels of controls and enforce them, it really starts to make a dent in people that are trying to misuse our electoral system. Impersonation. Every person is guilty of an offense who, with intent to mislead, falsely represents themselves to be any of the persons referred to in paragraph 2. That's like the candidate, the agent, delegate, anything like that. Causes anyone to falsely represent themselves to be any of those persons, create or causes to be created an image that is likely to be mistaken for an image of any of those persons, creates or causes to be created in limitation of the voice of any of those persons that is likely to be mistaken for the voice of the persons, or an audio recording that falsely represents anything said by any of those persons, distributes, transmits, or publishes an image referred to in paragraph C, or imitation or audio recording referred to in paragraph D. This is targeting deepfakes, and this is targeting any of the propaganda that is being put out there. So during an election, if you are trying to make it seem like somebody is saying something that they're not, that's a problem. And if you look at it this way, it's a problem because this strengthens the integrity of our elections. People need to be viewing what they're looking at online when it comes to candidates, and they need to be able to believe that what they're seeing is accurate, because that's how they're going to be making their voting decision. So if somebody puts up a picture of Pierre Poilievre and it says, I hate oil and gas, or they put up a picture of Pierre Poilievre and, it says, I love China, or I'm going to be Donald Trump's lapdog, or something like that. That's where this can come into play, because you are effectively saying that Pierre Poilievre is saying this when he actually didn't. And that causes undue influence on voters. That's a problem, right? That's a problem. Now, take this back. If CTV, remember when CTV made it look like Pierre Poilievre had said something about the dental plan that he didn't? Imagine that was actually run during an election. That would apply, because he didn't say that. So this is where it gets into it. And this handles the deep fakes. That much is obvious. So deep faking somebody's voice, deep faking somebody's appearance, that sort of thing. So the intent of this is to ensure that when people are viewing things online from a social media perspective, from an internet perspective, during an election, this doesn't apply outside an election, during an election, that people are seeing the right thing. Now, does there need to be some discussion on this? 100%. But the intent, I think, is solid. They just need to clean this up and make sure that this is going to apply properly. Unique influence by foreigners. No person or entity referred to in any of the paragraphs shall unduly influence an elector to vote or refrain from voting, or to vote or refrain from voting for a particular candidate, potential candidate, registered party, or eligible party at an election. So in one respect, I like this because this is trying to prohibit foreign interference. The other problem is how are you going to make them comply with it? What are you going to do? You're going to fine the government of China. So I like it in principle. I don't know how they're going to enforce it. False statements. Every person or entity is guilty of an offense that makes or publishes with the intention of affecting the results or disrupting the conduct of an election, a statement that they know is false or misleading in respect of the following, right? So it's essentially anybody who is knowingly making a false statement. You absolutely know better. You know what you're saying is wrong. You know what you're saying is false. And this is essentially casting negative or positive light on one candidate or the other, or the process or anything like that. So this is something that applies to foreign interference. It applies to people that are maliciously slandering other people. It prevents candidates from slandering other people. It prevents campaigns from slandering people. Prevents a lot of things like that. Again, in principle, I think it's a good idea, but there needs to be some discussion at committee to tighten this up. And at least they're putting a qualifier in there. So, with the intent of, so it's going to be on anyone who is prosecuting this type of infraction to prove that the person had knowledge otherwise. If they can't prove the person had knowledge otherwise, then they're not guilty of the act, right? So it'll be interesting to see how this discussion actually plays out in committee. Now, one of the biggest concerns is, okay, fine, you violate the Canada's Elections Act. So what? Well, here is the nuts and bolts of it. So this is where we get to it. If you violate the Canada Elections Act, you go all the way to the bottom. You may face up to a maximum penalty of $25,000 in the case of an individual, or $100,000 in the case of a corporation or an entity. Well, the longest ballot, they operate as an entity, don't they? So let's just run this through. If you are, let's just say, okay, we're looking at Terrebonne, right? Let's say that this bill was enacted right now. And the longest ballot, they went out and collected signatures for the 42 or so people that they got to sign up. And in those cases, it's reasonable to think right now that they're having people do the same thing and sign all these forms, right? Okay, fine. Well, here's what would happen. So the people that are inducing these people to violate the Elections Act, because you can only sign one form, the volunteers that are getting those signatures and collecting them, they could potentially be fined $25,000 each. And then the longest ballot could potentially be fined $100,000. The person signing the multiple forms, they could also be fined $25,000 for every single infraction. So if you sign 4 forms, you could potentially face up to a $100,000 fine, 25,000 times 4. Never mind if you sign 100, right? And as the candidate, you could potentially be fined $25,000 because of the maliciousness of the act that you are taking part of. So that could be a problem as well. So this is where all of this starts to come in together. So it's not only that, okay, well, you do these things, that's bad. Now you actually can face significant fines for each of the instances that you partake in. So if Elections Canada is looking at boosting their funding, all they need is the longest ballot to pull Battle River Crowfoot, and they'll be set up for years. But as we said before, most likely, a lot of this discovery is only going to happen after an election takes place and when an audit actually occurs. So even after this bill is passed, you could still see one more election where the longest ballot, tries to gum things up. But after that, and after that investigation occurs and these fines are all handed out, I don't think we'll see it ever again. Because here's the other thing. All these people have to sign their name and their address for it to be valid. So you're essentially handing Elections Canada through this whole process all the information that they need in order to actually come and charge you. Right? So this brings it all together. Without this, I don't think any of this really matters. But the fact that they're bringing this all together and they're putting in these stiff penalties to say, you know what, our elections are important, our elections need to stay secure, and we're going to actually fine you if you try to cause problems within our democracy. Now we get on to an interesting section. So I'm not going to read all of these, but what they're doing is they're going to be renaming some of the riding names. Now, some of you may be saying, well, they just renamed some of the riding names in the boundary change last year. Why are they doing it again? Well, because there's been some discussion, obviously, with the MP, with the people in the riding, and they said, you know what, we need to just change these because some of the riding names got really long, and they also ended up getting too cumbersome to put on literature, to write on social media posts all the time, to say. So these are the changes that they're proposing for Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Ontario, you can see Larry Brock's riding is up there. Saskatchewan and British Columbia. And the province of Quebec. So if you're in one of those ridings, just know that after this bill goes through, assuming it is passed, this is going to change the riding name to what you saw there, or assuming, I guess perhaps there's some discussion in committee and they can make some amendments to the riding names at that point. Maybe there's some more discussions that are going to happen and new riding names are going to be added. So just stick with the bill or stick with us and we'll update you as the bill navigates the different stages and we'll let you know if there's any changes. Now, speaking of following this and following the bill, Longest Ballot has been following the bill as well. And they don't have a lot to say with the new bill coming in and tabled. This was one of their posts. Finally, a ceiling. If C-25 passes and voters are banned from nominating more than one candidate, a riding like St. Boniface, St. Vital, Winnipeg, with 64,202 electors, has a maximum candidate load of 642. So that's their, I guess, attempt at humor at this, but they don't really have anything witty to say because it's going to completely undermine their efforts. Here's another post they have. They don't have anything to say. They're just showing Steve McKinnon. So why are they showing Steve McKinnon? Well, because he actually did have something to say, and he was asked a question by a reporter about the tabled bill and the effect it might have on the longest ballot.
What message are you sending to longest ballot activists with the measures that you've put in here? They're a pretty feisty bunch.
That the Parliament of Canada finds that to be a harassing behavior. I understand that they have a message that they wish to put forward, but the results of these efforts make, as I said in my earlier remarks, accessibility difficult, make the work of our world-renowned elections agency prohibitively difficult. In fact, we've seen now in the last two of the last by-elections that the chief electoral officer has had to use extraordinary powers to alter the form of the ballot. Citizens do not like this. Elections Canada does not like this. And there are other ways to put forward the message that they, I think, wish to communicate.
I can agree with that. I can agree with Liberal Steve McKinnon on that. And I think a lot of people will agree with that. Because as we said, through this process, we have seen bipartisan agreement when it comes to the longest ballot and when it comes to the changes that actually need to be put forward. So this is a good thing. I'm not going to attack Steve McKinnon for everything he says, especially if he makes something like a statement that makes sense. I'm not going to attack him for that. I will applaud him for that. Hopefully the applause encourages him to make more sense. But he's right. This attacks people with accessibility issues. This attacks seniors, attacks people with dyslexia, and many other ailments from being able to vote. These jokers seem to think that in upholding their Charter 3 rights, they get to violate other people's Charter 3 rights. Because that's what they're doing. And that's what we testify to in committee. That's what other people testify to in committee. So it's very, very pleasant to see the Liberals actually agreeing with common sense. Now, it's interesting because remember when we did our investigation and we did a deep dive and found all this stuff on the Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada's website related to the longest ballot? Well, it continues. Marxist-Leninist Party of Canada in the news. And you can see posts here. Elections Canada announces by-elections candidates and use of special ballot in Terrebonne. So that's related to the longest ballot. Work of the longest ballot shows broad support for electoral reform. This is the only party website that this is posted on. I wonder why that is. So, we've put forth our evidence. We know our conclusions. You're free to draw your own. But what all this comes down to is we're finally going to see, most likely, the end of the longest ballot initiative, because the restrictions that are being put in place are going to be so restrictive, it's going to be impossible. Like literally impossible to pull this off again. So this is the part that makes me laugh. Because we have a message for the two brothers and the longest ballot. See, guys, you have been doing this charade since roughly 2019. And you've been doing it in cooperation with the Rhinoceros Party and with hundreds of people across the country. And you state that your objective was to get electoral reform. You were trying to make changes to the Elections Act. And this is the mode that you've chosen to do. You've run in multiple elections. You've served as the agent for multiple elections. You've served as the agents for hundreds of candidates over that time. And you've effected zero change. You've been able to garner virtually zero support. Meanwhile, I have run in no elections. I have served as agent for no candidates. All I've done is knocked on doors. And I just started looking into you guys, really, last summer. So between last summer and now, I've actually been able to effect change in our Elections Act with my recommendations and with the support of all of our viewers behind us, because without them, this doesn't happen. So, collectively, we have been able to effect electoral reform in less than 8 months. You guys have been at this for over 7 years. So the lesson is that we've tried to tell you this before. You will not affect any type of change with your strategy. The way to affect change is you participate in the system. You have conversations. You rally support. You submit briefs, you submit evidence, you testify in committee, and you plead your case, and you convince parliamentarians that your ideas are worthy to put into the Canada Elections Act. That's how you affect change, and that's how you uphold our democracy, and that is how you get electoral reform. Class dismissed.